So let's move on to the second part of McMahan's essay. He said first he was going to look at the existence requirement and to give us some strategies for either reconciling it with our common sense views or reasons for rejecting it, so that we can preserve our common sense views. In the second part of the essay, what he said he's going to do is to give us reasons for thinking that death is indeed bad, which is directly taking on Epicurus. That is, directly taking on the really prime and essential Epicurean claim that death is not a bad thing for the person who dies. And we see that his strategy here for overcoming the Epicurean idea is much the same as Nagel's basic strategy, and that is to say that to a degree Epicurus is sort of undeniably right. That is, that death is not a positive evil in the sense that other things are positive evils for us, things that entail direct experienced sufferings like physical pain or mental pain. And death is not a bad like that. Death is another sort of bad. That death is a bad because it deprives us of goods. And he makes direct reference to Nagel, and in general I think that he agrees with that. That is, that death is a bad thing, and it's a bad thing because it deprives us of the goods of life. But like Nagel, he recognizes that that's not all that needs to be said, that there are certain complications that go along with the notion that death is bad because it deprives us of life. And we saw that Nagel pursued one of those complications, and that was the problem of whether or not something could be said to be bad for somebody if they were not aware of it and didn't suffer as a result of it. And what we came up with, or what Nagel came up with, is really a theory of bad things. That is, a theory that gave us the conditions under which it could be said that something bad had happened to somebody, and he was able to construct one that would include death. I think that the way to read this second section is to see that McMahan is pursuing another difficulty involved with saying that death is a deprivation. And that has to do, and the very heart of that has to do with what he calls counterfactual conditionalism. This is a notorious subject in philosophy in 20th century or contemporary philosophy is trying to figure out counterfactual conditionals. Because we think of the very idea that death is a bad because it deprives us of goods, what's sort of built into that view is something like this. We are assuming that death is a bad thing for a particular person because it deprives them of the goods of life. And what that means is that if they had not died, they would have experienced more of the goods of life. And there's your counterfactual conditional. Conditional because it's an if-then sentence. Counterfactual because it says what didn't happen. And what McMahan is trying to do in this section is to resolve some of the difficulties involved in making such counterfactual claims, and he gives us hypotheticals that highlight those difficulties. And that is that, say that we have a person, Joe, who is at the age of 29, I think, was tragically killed in a car accident, hit by a bus. We would say then that his death was tragic. But if the autopsy of Joe showed that he was in the last stages of terminal cancer and didn't know it, or any disease, then does that change our intuitions? That is, if we say that, well, if Joe had not been killed by being hit by the bus, Joe would have only gone on to live for 2 more months. So was his death as tragic as it first appeared? Probably not. So does that mean his death in general was not tragic? That's another question. And here's an example of somebody that he calls Mort, and Mort does have cancer, and Mort dies of cancer. And we ask ourselves, if whether Mort's death was tragedy. Intuitively we say yes, his death was a tragedy. So what does that mean? Are we saying then that if Mort died of a cerebral hemorrhage on Tuesday, March 2nd, are we saying that if Mort had not died of a cerebral hemorrhage on Tuesday, March 2nd, well, what would have happened? Well, he might have lived a few more days. So was his death tragic? That is, when we identify the cerebral hemorrhage that he had, a complication of his cancer, as being his cause of death, and we say that, well, if that hadn't happened, he would have continued to live. Well, yeah, he would have continued to live, but for just a short period of time without really much quality of life. So our intuitions say there that his death really wasn't tragic. But then we ask ourselves, well, okay, but does that mean that his death wasn't tragic? No. I mean, his death was tragic. So there are complications involved in this notion that, well, we say that somebody's death was a bad thing because we say that if they hadn't died, they would have continued to enjoy more of life's goods. But that seems to break down in certain cases. I mean, it's an explanation for why somebody's death is tragic, because sometimes people die, and it seems that if they hadn't died, they would have, died how they did, they would have not really gone on to experience more of life's goods. So how can we say then that their lives are tragic? He gives another example of a soldier killed in charge of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War in the British Army. A young man leading the charge is killed by a particular bullet fired by a particular soldier. Was his death tragic? Sure. But if we say that the cause of his death was being shot by a particular bullet from a particular Russian soldier, then if he hadn't been killed by that bullet, let's say he would have been killed by another bullet a moment afterwards fired by a different soldier. So was his death tragic? That is, the particular cause of his death tragic? Well, if he would have been killed a moment later by another bullet, then it wasn't tragic. But then we'd say, well, yeah, wait a second, his death was tragic. I mean, the young man dying. So how do we resolve these problems? Well, he offers a certain theory, or he offers a certain way of conceptualizing it. It has to do with what he calls identifying the antecedent. That is, the if in the if-then conditional. And he has this theory that what we should do is not to identify the antecedent, that is the cause of death, with the immediate approximate cause of death, but with the whole causal sequence that leads up to that cause. Let's take Mort, the person who dies of cancer. The proximate cause of their death was the cerebral hemorrhage, but what he calls the transitive cause is the whole causal sequence that leads up to that hemorrhage. So when we say that if Mort had not died when he did, he would have gone on to experience more of the goods of life, what we don't mean is the cause of death is not identified as the cerebral hemorrhage. The cause of death is identified as the whole causal sequence that leads up to it. So when we identify the cause of Mort's death, we're identifying the cancer in general, the illness in general. And when we say that if Mort had not died, he would have gone on to experience more of the goods of life, and that's why his death was bad. What we really mean by the cause of his death is not the immediate or proximate cause of his death, but the whole causal sequence involving his cancer. And what we imagine is not that he didn't die on Tuesday, but rather Wednesday, but we imagine that he hadn't gotten cancer at all. So McMahan is really trying to resolve some of the problems in just saying that death is bad because it's a deprivation, and specifically trying to resolve some problems with claiming that if someone had not died at time t, they would have experienced more of the goods of life. What we really mean by that.